Good morning, everybody. Well, a brief pause in the Brexit wars as commentators and politicians look ahead to the budget tomorrow, where we're told there'll be an end to so-called austerity. Elections taking place today in Brazil, which is about to move, I think, quite sharply to the right, and also elections taking place in Hesse. And that's going to be interesting because I think Angela Merkel will be further weakened by those elections. So perhaps now is a good time for us to sit back and think more broadly about Brexit on a day when everyone's not trying to knock chunks out of each other. But we'll also, over the course of the next couple of hours, discuss that appalling massacre that took place in a synagogue in Pittsburgh yesterday. My feeling that anti-Semitic crime does appear to be on the increase right across Europe, right across America. We'll talk a bit about that and perhaps why we think that's happening. But I want to talk about Europe. I want to talk about the origins, really, of the European project, how it developed, how it evolved, and joining me to do that is journalist, environmentalist, former MEP, author of a recent book on Brexit, Stanley Johnson. Good morning, Stanley.
Good morning. Lovely to be here.
Good. Now, people know who you are, but what they don't know is that you were, of course, one of the first ever elected MEPs.
I was indeed, 1979. 1979 was the first direct elections to the European Parliament. Those were the days, by the way, when the Conservative Party was gung-ho, full of enthusiasm for Europe, at least insofar as the MEPs who came into Parliament in June 1979. Would you believe it? We had 61 Conservative MEPs.
Yeah.
61 Conservative MPs. I think there were 17 Labour MEPs, but I'm not sure they took their seats right at the beginning. And yes, I would say, on the whole, the vast majority of those believed in the European project. Don't forget, Mr. Heath was the one who got Britain into Europe. Mr. Heath became Prime Minister in June 1970. Britain joined officially 1st January 1973. Heath was not at that stage an anathema. He became an anathema later on. But anyway, we came in, now to be fair, it wasn't just the MEPs who, as it were, had a good campaign. We came in on the back of Mrs. Thatcher's May 1979 campaign.
And she, of course, at the time, and people forget this, but she, of course, at the time was a quite enthusiastic marketeer, was the word used in those days, supporter of the common market.
Yes, she was enthusiastic. I wouldn't say she was absolutely enthusiastic in the sense that she wanted to have us for drinks every week in number 10 Downing Street, but I certainly went twice to number 10 Downing Street and met her. In fact, one day I think I did something that was really useful because she had lost her handbag, and I happened to see that she'd actually parked it behind a potted plant. And she went around saying, "Where's my handbag?" And I said, "Madam, I think your handbag is behind the plant." I think the most useful thing I did.
Now, was that the handbag she used at Fontainebleau to get us our rebate back?
Well, that I think was 1984.
It was,
and she certainly handbagged them then, and we, by the way, still got that. Going back to your point, though, just try and imagine an era when at least quite a large number of tourists were pretty enthusiastic about Europe. So that, for me, is what I remember. The kind of great sense of course, it wasn't the first time the European Parliament met, but as you say, it's the first time we'd had direct elections to the European Parliament.
But in those days, the enthusiasm that the Conservative Party had for the European project. I, by the way, was a Conservative Party member.
Come back. Come and join us. Come over to Macedonia.
I was so unenthusiastic about it that I started voting Green in European elections.
Nothing wrong with voting Green.
Because in those days, they were, of course, a very Eurosceptic party. So it's funny how things change. But you were there, and you'd worked at the European Commission, so you were part of, I guess, this new experiment is how it must have felt in a way.
Well, I've got to tell you, there's a book by Christopher Booker called The Great Deception, and in a chapter in there he says, how did the European project arise and become Maastricht and so on and so forth? And he says that he reminds us of something called the Spinelli Club and the Crocodile Club, and I was the only Tory Euro MP who joined that right from the start. So in a way I do feel a bit builded. But coming to Mrs. Thatcher, don't forget, yes, she was, as you say, keen on the market, but the irony is that the thing she pushed most, which of course was the single market, was in a way the thing which also has led to the great trap, because the single market brought in qualified majority voting.
Yeah.
And that is really what has been too much for this country to stomach.
I mean, did you, back in 1979, were you one of those people who saw the European project as post-war cooperation, trade, friendship, or were you a believer that we should head towards a single currency, an enlarged European Union, even a militarised European Union?
No, I definitely was not on those lines. For me, don't forget, I came in as an environmentalist. I'd already had 6 years in the European Commission as head of something rather quaintly named the European Commission's Prevention of Pollution and Nuisances Division. The only nuisance I can remember was a German chap who who worked for me. He refused to come to the office at all. He said, I work at night. Anyway, these were the days for me when I combined two interests, the environmental interest and the European interest. So it was absolutely a natural fit. Just at that moment, I'm talking about January 1973, Britain joined, Ireland joined, Denmark joined. But at the same time, the EU got on with 3 new policies, and 2 of them were really very vital for this country. One was the regional policy, and the other was the environmental policy. I had the good luck to be appointed, as I say, the first head of the pollution thing. So I wasn't so much interested in down the road on the European currency and so on and so forth, common defence. No, I saw this as a wonderful chance to push things through at the environmental. And that's what we did in the run, by the way, to the referendum. We set up something called Environmentalists for Europe.
I remember. No, I do, absolutely. But I've also spoken to people who, of your vintage, who were there in the 70s, working in the European Commission. And one or two of them have said to me that we went in there with very high-minded ideals about what this new project could achieve. But they've said to me they now feel quite disenchanted, in a sense, with where we are. I mean, let's just look at it today. We've got Hungary and Poland, where Article 7 of the treaty is being applied and their voting rights are being removed. I understand that may well apply to Romania before very long. We have an Italian government, a new Italian government, with a very clear majority of support across Italy that has put forward a budget that's been rejected by the European Commission. I mean, does a part of you think this project's gone too far?
You raise a good point. It's a very good point. And indeed, I can remember, some time ago saying, it's not an open and shut case. This case of staying in Europe or leaving Europe. There are arguments on both sides, and you, of course, have been strongly arguing for the leave side. I argue strongly for the remain side, but. You're quite right. There's some things out there like moving, more and more to a common currency, moving to a single European government, moving to having single defence ministers, chancellors of the exchequer, one for the whole project. But then I said to myself, look, you've got to go back to metaphors here. Metaphor. For me, Europe's always been a ship steering, across an ocean to a uncertain direction, and I always thought the useful thing was for Britain still to be on board. Now, of course, there's another argument which says no. Britain, the Europe is a train, gathering speed on a fixed rail, and the best thing we can do would bail out. I am, I can see both sides at the moment. Though I look at the Chequers proposal. I mean, if I may say so, Chequers. I'm talking about, the current government proposal. I say this is very odd because we're going to get the worst of both worlds with the Chequers proposal.
I agree with that. I mean, I think to leave the treaty, but to still be wrapped up inside the customs union, unable to take any of the the benefits that could come from Brexit.
So you prefer to stay in than
well, no, I wouldn't prefer to stay. No, of course, I don't want to stay in under any circumstances because I think.
So what do you want to have?
Well, I think, look, isn't it, when we move house or we change relationships or whatever it is, we come to a fork in the road, we make a decision, and the best thing to do is to go with that and try and make a success of it. And I fear this Prime Minister is rather caught between the two. I mean, do you understand, by the way, why so many British people look at the behaviour of Barnier, Tusk and Juncker and think these are sort of unelected, rather arrogant bullies?
Yeah, this sounds to me a bit like the popular press.
I'm saying it.
Well, I'm not saying you're not the popular press.
But I mean, they look awful? Humiliating a British Prime Minister the way they've done it. Isn't there something about these people? And one of the fundamental flaws, I think, with the European project is that the government of Europe are the unelected Commission, and this is power without accountability.
Hold on. I mean, we're going to get into theology here, but the European Commission at the moment is, as I recall, appointed by vote of the European Parliament, or at least the leader of the European Commission is appointed by vote of the European Parliament. I think the others have maybe not.
Yeah, we get given a choice of one. I mean, that's how democratic it is.
I have known some really top-level European commissioners, and some of them mean British, I can tell you. Leon Britton, Christopher Tugendhat, Roy Jenkins, fine man. Neil Kinnock. I mean, it may sound, these are people who really tried hard. Where we are now, I think, is in a total dilemma. The Irish question has, as it were, got so far up the agenda that we're left, as I say, in this limbo. And I think we need to take a deep breath at this moment and say, are we actually going to go down the route the government has proposed?
All right, well, let's talk about that. We're also going to talk about a new book that Stanley Johnson's got out. In a moment, we'll do that. But for now, you're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it is 10:15. Now, Stanley Johnson, it's your 25th book, I understand. Is that right?
Yes, it is indeed. I mean, you could say 25 too many. I remember when I left school, in heaven's sake, it must have been 1958, my headmaster called me and he said, Stanley, I've got one piece of advice. He didn't actually said Johnny. He called me Johnny. I got one piece of advice. I said, what's that? He said, never write a book. It's unforgivable.
And here you are. So what's this one about? Come on, tell us.
This one, Compromat. Yep. Compromat just come out in paperback. It is a fun book. It's a fun book. It's a satire on Brexit on the one hand and Trump on the other hand. And it all begins with a Russian president who is not unlike Mr. Putin going off to eastern Siberia with the American presidential candidate who is not unlike Donald Trump and firing a dart at a Siberian tiger. Unfortunately, the dart hits the American presidential candidate in the backside. And history unfolds from there, because there is, of course, a transmitting device firmly lodged in the American presidential candidate's backside, and for all we know, it is still there.
Right, okay. Well, it sounds like fun. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it.
Well, wait a minute. I'm going to sign it for you to Nigel. To Nigel. All good wishes.
Well, very good. Well, that can't be bad. I've got some Sunday reading.
And I'm very glad you almost admitted that life would be better for Britain if we stayed in than if we went in.
No, I have to say, I think to be trapped inside a customs union is ridiculous. I tell you what I don't understand, and, you know, you've been part of this Conservative Party for a very long time. How is she still there as Prime Minister? Because virtually everybody I speak to, whether they're supporters of your son, Boris, within the party, whichever side they're on, everybody seems to agree in private that she's not really up to the job, and yet she goes to the 1922 committee, the desk lids all bang with approval. I mean, how is she still there?
She's a remarkably able lady. She's a remarkably charming lady. She believes tremendously that it is her duty to deliver Brexit, and she has persuaded herself, though not actually me and some others, that the Brexit which she has now cobbled together is the one which is deliverable, and she's going to go for it. I mean, history may say this was a woman whose determination in the end rivaled that of Mrs. Thatcher.
Now, clearly, March 29th next year, when Article 50 expires, whatever deal we're wrapped up in, if we leave the treaties on that day, we have left the European Union.
And you're going to have to leave the European Parliament.
Yes,
all those
I am
expenses
I
down
am
the
the
drain.
turkey. I am the turkey that voted for Christmas, and you can imagine how hated I am by the other British
They're going to
MEPs.
lock you out of your office, Nigel, and they're going to say, I'm afraid you're going to have to walk home or take a taxi.
I'll be out on the street. There's no question about it. And you're still a Remainer. Do you think that we are going to leave on March the 29th?
I personally don't think we're going to leave on March the 29th, because I think that even if Mrs. May gets a vote through Parliament on her, on what you might call checkers, even if she does that, the moment that vote has been taken, there will be a second vote. The way they're structuring it, the vote in Parliament, as Dominic Raab made clear the other day, there'll first be a vote on the deal, but then there will be an amendable series of resolutions, or one resolution,
including a second referendum.
I suspect that's what's going to happen, and I think, therefore, as long as this vote intervenes, before March the 29th, there will be time. There will be time for the government, in the light of the resolution, which will probably be passed after they voted for the deal, to say we've actually got to postpone the Article 51 because we've got to take another look.
Do you understand how just furious many, many millions of people will be in this country if an open vote that was given to them and explained by everybody in terms of we will do what, we will enact whatever you decide. I mean, would this not be the greatest democratic betrayal?
I don't see it that way, Nigel.
Well, why not?
I tell you
what else can it be?
Let me just explain. Okay, let's say you get a narrow vote in Parliament in favour of Chequers. Just I'm using Chequers as a shorthand. Let's say you get that. But then let's say you have a vote following the vote of principle, which says, actually, we think let's have a double lock on this, and let's make sure that the people of this country actually agree that Parliament has done the bidding of the nation with this Chequers deal. And, if people don't take your view, as many no doubt will, then the country will vote overwhelmingly and say, yes, Parliament got it right, bully for Parliament. But it's just possible that they may say, well, actually, we don't think this scheme of staying forever in the EU without actually being in the EU, apparently forever, is the right scheme. Hey-ho, that's what I think.
Well, I have to say, I genuinely believe that there is an underestimate in London of just how angry people in the country are feeling on this. A real detachment between the metropolitan elites and ordinary voters out there, Stanley. That's my point of view, and we'll see where we go. But let's move across to the other side of the Atlantic, and with or without the dart in his backside. President Trump's style as a leader, how do you assess it?
He is a most remarkable man, is he not? I mean, I listened to him last night post the Pittsburgh shooting, which we may come on to, saying, we've got to realise that all this rhetoric only leads to violence. Well, I mean, point the finger at yourself, Mr. President, I say.
Doesn't the rhetoric, though, go both ways? I mean, isn't it? I mean, yes, I know that Trump is absolutely out there in what he says, but isn't it equally true that the left fires some pretty unpleasant language back at him too?
I think that is very, very likely, and whether it's just the left, it may not be. I think it's probably some centre ground as well. I, of course, was pretty cautious about Mr. Trump because I was very much bothered that he was going to pull America out of the Paris Convention on climate change. This, for me, was actually a very, very serious thing, and he is going to do that. And by the way, what he's doing now on oil exploration in the Alaska reserves is another thing. So he's bad news on the environment as far as I can see. It's the most bizarre. It looks to me at the moment as though he's playing this for the midterm elections.
Which are in 9 days' time.
9 days' time. And I think he's longing for this caravan of migrants from Honduras actually to get to the American border in time for him to deploy the National Guard. Unfortunately, they're being a bit sluggish. They're pushing their prams and they're about 500 miles away.
I mean, you can disagree with them on the environment, but you look at the US economy and growth that's happening, and maybe in many ways America's standing in the world since he became president. I mean, people do fear and respect this American president. Is he a good president?
Not from my point of view. I mean, I say that, more in sorrow than in anger. I do mind tremendously about the Paris Convention, for example, on climate change. I mind tremendously about the way he's going to demolish the Endangered Species Act in America. I mind tremendously the way he is blocking all kinds of the EPA, the American the Environmental Protection Agency, being hollowed out. These things do worry me a lot. Worries me also, of course, that he's blocking the appointment of judges in the WTO. And the WTO is about to be denuded. Actually, I don't mean denuded, I mean neutered.
You mean neutered, yes. Well, the Russians may help him with that. Yeah. All right, you're not a Trump supporter, but yesterday we saw this horrendous attack take place in that mosque in Pittsburgh. This was not an Islamic extremist. This was a white guy who was shouting out death to Jews. In some ways, surprisingly, because you always think, is this going to be some sort of far right-wing nutcase who says Trump's wonderful? Not a Trump supporter, just a complete rabid anti-Semite prepared to go out and commit mass murder. And we've seen, if you look at France, if you look at Brussels, Belgium, and we have seen a rise of anti-Semitic attacks, of anti-Semitic behaviour. What do you think's going on?
Well, in America, you can't, as it were, separate this one out from gun control. I mean, gun control is a really, really important issue.
But
still.
Trump's arguing, had people in the mosque had guns, there'd have been less of a problem.
I know he's argued that.
Synagogue, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's for me, the gun control issue is something. I do wonder whether you'd have that kind of outrage if you'd had more serious. Now, you may say, well, in this country you just have a rise in knife crime, but in the end, it could well be that having a rise in knife crime is the price you pay for very strong controls on guns. Do I see a rise in anti-Semitism in this country? I don't, actually. I really don't. The Labour Party obviously went through a traumatic period recently, but I think they've come out of it. No, I don't get that. I don't get that sense at all. This does seem to me a very tolerant country.
But it is happening in Paris, and it is happening in Brussels.
Know more than that.
Yeah, and it really is. And in fact, we've seen thousands of people Jewish people leave those cities in the last couple of years and go to live in Israel or move elsewhere.
It is possible, I suppose, that you could link this to the demographic changes in those cities which you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about Strasbourg and Paris and Brussels, even I've obviously spent a lot of time in Brussels, and there are, of course, huge quarters of Brussels where there has been an inflow from North Africa.
Yes, no, I mean, there certainly has. And finally, Stanley, unavoidably, your son, I mean, I'm sure you're proud of all your children, but you have one particular son who's rather well known and is thought to be lining himself up at some point to perhaps go for the Tory party leadership. Has Boris got what it takes to be Prime Minister?
Well, now, this is total news for me, that he's lining himself up.
Well, that's how it looks to everybody.
Well, I think everybody's got it wrong as far as I'm concerned. Boris is on my line, and that is that Chequers is not the right answer to Brexit. Do you see what I mean? I honestly think you've got to take this gentleman at his word. If he was an ambitious careerist, would he really have stepped down from being Foreign Secretary? I think he's on the principle here, and you would have done the same. The principle here is the deal which was put before the Cabinet some time ago. I was in July, I think. Just not the right deal. And to that extent, he is fighting for a different deal, and I don't think that you can take any. As far as I know, he's absolutely not fighting for a change of Prime Minister, and certainly not fighting to be one of the candidates.
Right. So it's on the principle of Brexit. That's why he's done this.
That's it. Is it difficult to believe that chap does something for principle?
Well, if you read our tabloid press, you'd think we all do everything from the absolutely worst of motives. Stanley Johnson, thank you very much for coming in this morning and telling us a bit about what Europe was like in the old days.
Good old days.
When it had very high-minded intentions.
Barrage and Co. Right.
Well, I was elected in 99, you see, and perhaps I've done my bit not to be helpful. Stanley, thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 10:30. Well, veteran Europhile Stanley Johnson, as entertaining and charming as ever, but he said something very interesting at the end there. He said that he believes that when Mrs May comes back finally with the deal, and she will come back with a deal, already the Chancellor of the Exchequer is saying his whole budget would have to be ripped up if there wasn't a deal. There's no way this government is going to accept no deal. There will be a deal, probably one that people like me absolutely hate, but there will be a deal. But Stanley believes there'll be an amendment and we're heading towards a second referendum. He also said he does not think we're leaving on March the 29th, as we're scheduled to do under Article 50. When I made the point to him that I think there really would be considerable anger out there in the country if we didn't leave on that day, he didn't really agree with me. So is Stanley Johnson right? Are we, in fact, not going to leave on March the 29th? And are the consequences, as he seems to think, quite insignificant? Joe in Neasden says you're talking a lot of sense, Stanley. So there's a supporter there. I'm going to go to William, a new caller from Muswell Hill. Good morning, William.
Good morning. Hello.
Hello. What did you make of Stanley Johnson's comments at the end there?
I mean, it's fair enough to have his own opinion.
Yep.
His opinion's his opinion. I don't pay too much attention to it, to be honest.
Okay.
I think it's fair enough to give him a voice, and that's fair, but it's not my opinion.
What's your opinion, William?
Well, I don't see there'll be a second referendum. I just don't see that happening. It doesn't really calculate in my head that will happen. And, I hope going forward that it's just going to be a nice, clean break. And I'm actually really positive about the whole situation. I'm 32, and I'm an interpreter. So I've been fortunate enough to live and work in Europe for the past 8 years, and I speak 3 languages. And like you, I love Europe. And I feel that really after Brexit, it's going to be it's going to create more connection with each country of Europe and improve our relationships. Relationships are going to become more harmonious and more fruitful.
Yeah, I've always thought, William, that we were sort of always a bit of a square peg in a round hole, and that somehow, being inside the club, we were constantly bumping into each other. I rather agree with you. I think outside a political union, we'll probably get on very much better.
I believe, I 100% agree with you. I think that the British people are fantastic people. Our country is a very successful country full of hardworking people, and now more than ever, the need for connection, the want for connection is there. I'm not really interested in the politics of the European Union, and I wanted to ask you a question.
Go on.
Because out of all my friends, I was the only one who voted to leave, and many of my friends can't really come up with a reason why they voted to remain. They just sort of say, "Oh well, the government didn't have a plan," blah blah blah. And I wanted to ask you.
And of course, William, it's the status quo. That's people do often fear change. It seems to me.
Yes.
But your question to me, William.
The beauty is that the change is where the gold is. The idea that we get to go back inside, look inside ourselves, work really hard, improve our own country, retrain our own people, and I myself, I feel extremely valued as an interpreter because I speak those other languages, and I'm helping people to communicate and speak English. I love my job, and I just feel that there's a huge amount of opportunity. If we're clever, it's going to be fantastic.
Well, William, above all, on the politics of it, we'll be sovereign. On the economics of it, we can become competitive, and that's what I really desperately want. Thank you, William, for calling. That's what I want, and I'm worried we're not going to get it being wrapped up in a customs union. Your Facebook messages. Alison says, for me, that chat with Stanley just proves the EU will fall in the future. Kevin, he did admit, Stanley, that it had perhaps gone wrong in some ways. Perhaps it had become a little bit overstretched from the early vision that he had. Kevin says, all Ramonas believe in the European empire. Stanley's just another one of them. Craig says, Stanley changed his mind a while ago and back leave. No, he didn't. He seems to have gone back again. He doesn't know what he's doing. Now, I think what Stanley said was he respected the vote. As so many of them said, they respect the vote, but now they all want a second referendum. That respect, it doesn't seem last all that long. All Ramonas, like Stanley, support big businesses. Well, I'm afraid big business is very important in all of this. It does have the view of most in Brussels. I'm going to Waltham Forest to speak to Harry. Hi, Harry.
Good morning, Nigel.
So, do you think he's right, Stanley, when he says we won't leave at the end of March?
He better be wrong. If we're not out at the end of March 29 next year, I will be very, very, extremely annoyed.
Yeah, I think a lot of us will be extremely annoyed. I tried to put to him, Harry, that his view that we could sort of erase the referendum effectively without there being consequences, he didn't seem to think there would be big consequences, but you clearly do.
Well, unfortunately, he suffers from the usual Remainer complaint, which is complacence and arrogance.
Right, and is that...
Can I tell you something?
Go on.
Wherever I go, I'm a very chatty person. I like to talk to people. The wife says I talk too much. But I always ask, if given the opportunity, the one question. I say to them, what do you think of this Brexit business? Now, quite a few are still hard Remainers or leavers. A few have left either camp to go the other way. But there are very, very many angry people out there.
And what do you think is the source of that anger, Harry?
Well, they can see that ever since we had the referendum 2.5 years ago, we've had nothing but treachery and double-dealing and stabbing in the back. And this call for a second vote, this people's vote, if they believe in democracy, why didn't they get behind the result of the first referendum?
Well, Harry, I couldn't agree more. We've had the people's vote. Thank you very much. Tom says, this is what I like about your show. Two people who disagree on things, but can be respectful about it. About time the nation did the same. And Tom, I have, ever since I've been here at LBC, tried to make the point that I will listen to any point of view, debate any point of view, concede good points that the other side make, and we ought to be doing democracy, and we ought to be doing debate much more in this manner. And I fear that throughout many of our universities, perhaps even many of our schools, we're not having proper, objective debate on things. It concerns me deeply. Roy is calling from Croydon. Hi, Roy.
Morning, Nigel. 2 points here,
Yes.
Nigel. First of all, I think you let Stanley off the hook there, really. What you should have said to him was, if Mrs May doesn't deliver on Brexit, I mean, I've been a lifelong Tory voter, Nigel.
Yeah.
If she doesn't deliver on Brexit, how is she going to expect it to win the next election? You know, I'm expecting her to deliver Brexit, and we leave next March, 29th of March next year.
Well, if we don't leave, Roy, it doesn't really matter who wins the next election that much, does it?
Well, not really, because
That's the point.
If we stay in the EU with stuff, the Corbyn gets in with stuff, Nigel, so it doesn't matter either way, really. My second point to you, Nigel.
Yeah.
When is Mrs May going to produce a white paper telling everybody and explaining to everybody what the future plans of the European Union are? I.e., come 2025, Mr Juncker, Mr Verhofstadt, Mr Tusk have made it perfectly clear that the EU army is coming. There'll be one chancellor covering all EU countries. They want to take control of all countries' banks inside the European Union. When is Mrs May going to produce this white paper explaining to everybody?
Here's the odd thing, Roy. Here's the odd thing, Roy. I quote repeatedly, I did it with Andrew Adonis last week, I quote repeatedly from the latest State of the Union speech given by Jean-Claude Juncker about, as you say, increased militarisation, etc. And everybody in this country says, oh, well, it won't really happen. So it's very difficult to get the truth of it. Roy, thank you. Going to quickly squeeze in Brian from Sunderland. Brian, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nigel. Nigel, I've said this to a few of my friends. I was just saying to your producer there.
Yep.
I believe in Brexit. I voted to leave. I don't think it's going to happen in March. And the reason I don't think it's going to happen is because of the government we have don't want it to happen. Theresa May will call a general election. Mm-hmm. She will state that she needs the people to really give her that confidence to do it. The Labour Party will win, unfortunately. The Labour Party will win on the grounds that they will promise to hold a second referendum, and the 2 million odd students that weren't eligible to vote, that are now legally old enough to vote, will do. We will stay in the European Union, and it will all be put to bed.
Well, Brian, I hope you're wrong on almost every single point you've made on that phone call. But you may be right. Brian, I just think there'd be huge consequences of us not doing what the referendum told our government to do. Brian, thank you. Liam in Romford's my next caller. Hi, Liam.
Hello, Mr. Farage.
Good morning. So, Stanley Johnson doesn't think we're going to leave and doesn't seem to think it's a problem.
It's beyond the pale. I'm so angry now, it's just ridiculous. If we do not leave on WTO rules now, on May the 29th, I can't see anything other than perhaps civil disobedience happening. It's just... I'm even worried there might be a civil war, because this is... it's immeasurable how angry I am right now.
Yeah,
we had a vote.
Liam, I understand the anger, but isn't it also true that generally, as a people, we're a pretty peaceful lot, aren't we?
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, look at Magna Carta, the wars with King John, the Peasants' Revolt. We've even got a film coming out now about Peterloo.
Yes, there is a film.
There's a reason we have all these rights, and that's because we fight for them. And now we've had a democratic process called a referendum. They're saying they're respecting it. They're not respecting it at all. How do they expect people to react?
So you genuinely fear, Liam,
students that are now eligible to vote.
Liam, you genuinely fear. You
Sorry?
genuinely fear serious civil disorder, yeah?
I feel that I can no longer stand idly by, as the saying goes. And if our result is not respected, I feel there's no other way.
Well, I'm not going to encourage in any way violent, unlawful disorder, but I think there'll be certainly peaceful protests, and I might even be part of that myself. You never know. Liam, thank you. Coming up, we'll get the latest from a developing story that is understood that the owner of Leicester City Football Club was inside the helicopter that crashed in a car park outside the ground as it left the stadium last night following Leicester's Premier League game. That in a moment. For now, you're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC And it's 10:46. At 8:30 last night, a dramatic helicopter crash outside Leicester City football ground. A big fireball, understood to be on board, was the Thai billionaire Wiche Siwatanaprabha, the owner and chairman of Leicester City. Let's go to the ground now and speak to LBC's reporter there, Alex Hulse. Alex, good morning.
Good morning. Well, it's a very different atmosphere here at the King Power Stadium compared with, just 2 years ago, which I see what Hanaprabha helped the club win the Premier League in 2016.
That's right.
Fans here have been devastated over the reports and fears that the owner may be dead after the crash last night. They've been leaving flowers and tributes outside the ground. They've been telling me he's given the fans and the club everything.
It's the best thing that ever happened. When they took over, it's the best thing that ever happened to this club, and it does everything. Every time you came down here for home games, it was always the same. You see him smile, and that means a lot. That does.
They've brought so much success for the club and invested so much of their own personal money, and they've done a fantastic job for Leicester City, and it's just so tragic. If what we're hearing is true, it's terrible.
It's just sadness. Thoughts go with the family and anybody else that's there, the owners, pilot, whoever else was on that flight.
Well, emergency services were called here, as we know, at around 8:30 p.m. after the helicopter left as normal after a home match. Someone told me just in the last half an hour that she saw it as she was in her garden, and she said it fell like a sack of potatoes out of the sky. Now we know it began spinning out of control just shortly after taking off, downing in a staff car park before bursting into flames. There are only reports at the moment. We're not clear on how many were on board. Reports suggest 5 are feared dead, including Mr. Siwatanaprabha. Photos taken at the match suggest the owner and his daughter, 2 pilots, and one other person who's unidentified at this time were on board as the helicopter took off. The government's air accident investigation branch have sent a team here to look into what's happened. They've also said this morning anyone with information should contact Leicestershire Police.
Thank you, Alex, very much indeed. Well, it fell like a stone. Sounds like something really was wrong, badly wrong. Well, let's just have a little think about the legacy here with Leicester City Football Club. I'm going to talk to Rob Harris, global football writer for the Associated Press. Good morning, Rob.
Morning.
It really was a period of extraordinary success, wasn't it, for Siwatanaprabha buying this club in 2010, and it was an astonishing win in 2016, wasn't it, of the Premier League?
Yeah, these are the types of triumphs that we thought might be unattainable in the days of vast spending in terms of the leading clubs and the disparities growing, but they really managed to pull the side together because it wasn't just the fact they won the title, it was the fact that they were only promoted back to the Premier League 2 years earlier. They nearly were relegated in 2015, and then they produced that remarkable surge through the season to actually triumph. And, it was the first time since 1978 that a team had won a title for the first time, an English title for the first time in its history, and it really did put Leicester on the map.
And as you say, achieved in an age of huge global money going into the Premier League, which sort of makes it even more remarkable. Is it too early to speculate what the future of Leicester City Football Club is now, if, as we understand, the chairman indeed was killed in that crash last night?
Yeah, obviously there's no official word on his condition, but his family members were involved with the club, or have been involved with the club, his son as well. So it's not just a single person, indeed, who is involved with the running. And I think actually when we talk about them as being international owners, they're often quite maligned at times in the Premier League. Manchester United, the Glazers can be quite distant, in fact very distant from their fans. Stan Kroenke as well, quite distant from the Arsenal supporters. But they really recognise, or seem to recognise, that it was a community club at Leicester. They would do things that meant there was more engagement between the family and the fans in Leicester, particularly as they were winning the title. Things like beer outside the stadium given to them, and donuts as well. So I think they really recognise actually that football is more than just a business. There is fans at the heart of it as well, even though they were, as well, very focused back in Thailand, actually, on using the Leicester success as well to harness their King Power duty-free business there.
So, a pretty sad day for British football.
Well, I mean, obviously nothing is confirmed at the moment, but those scenes last night were incredibly distressing and certainly put into sort of sharp focus amidst all the acumen that can often be in the game, just the human touch and the fact that people are behind these football clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob Harris, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And yeah, the helicopter crashed and it went up in flames. And I think my feeling is with helicopter crashes and light aircraft crashes, and of course I was in one once myself, that probably very often I would suspect people do actually survive the impact, but it's the fireball that kills people. So we're awaiting confirmation, suspected up to 5 people killed in that crash. I'm going to take, before the top of the hour, some more calls on what Stanley Johnson said. Stanley Johnson saying that he does not think we will leave the European Union on March the 29th next year. He thinks Parliament will stop it. Is he right? And what are the consequences if he is? James is a new caller from Reading. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Nigel. Pleasure to talk to you.
So,
sorry?
Go on. What did you make of Stanley's words?
Well, I remember working in finance 8 years ago when we just crashed out of the ECU. We tried to stay in the European exchange rate mechanism and we couldn't.
Yeah.
And I remember the economist saying to us, right, everybody, get in your cars, drive home tonight, but you're only allowed to use the gear stick and the pedals. You can't use the steering wheel. And that's how they're managing the European economy. Only monetary policy, no fiscal policy. I don't want to get too technical,
yes,
but it's not surprising that we're having all these problems in Europe at the moment. And I think there's a huge downside risk of staying in the European Union, because if you remember when Greece got into trouble, even though we're not in the euro, we were called upon for something like 800 million or a billion
yes, we were.
Contribution. Well,
yes.
You just wait, and if Italy gets into trouble. That's the first point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point. It's a very valid point, James. And I thought it was fascinating to see the manner in which Juncker publicly rejected the Italians' budget last week. I mean, it really is heading for a major conflict, isn't it?
Well, yes, and if Italy fails, the scale of debt that Italy has, I mean, something like $2.3 trillion. It dwarfs Greece. And so, the potential for a downside risk there is much bigger. The other point I wanted to make, if you don't... Can I make another point?
Go on, do, please.
Yeah, I've always been slightly smug as a British person and looked upon places like China and Russia that strictly control the broadcast media with a kind of sense of, well, we're better than that. But I find that the arguments, the political establishment completely dominates the broadcast media. I mean, if you look, you've got The Guardian, you've got The Independent, you've got The Economist, you've got The Financial Times, you've got The Times. You could just go on and on. You've got the BBC, who just broadcast day after day this kind of anti-Brexit diatribe of all the terrible things that are going to happen.
Despite Brexit, they say, James. We've got some good economic data, despite Brexit.
I know, and if we liberalise trade, cut tariffs, if we set our own tax regime, this is why the European Union, they know that we have to stay in the single market, they know that we have to stay in the customs union, because as long as we stay aligned with them, we can't compete effectively. But the moment that we do, if we liberalise, go to Singapore, go to Switzerland.
Absolutely. James, that's the opportunity, isn't it? Absolutely. Thank you for your call.